from the Goyim, so I'm not sure if there's a bit of revenge. Somebody has hanging, it looks like Vatican City. Someone has a banner with a crucifix. Maybe it's a soccer symbol. I don't know, but it's not the English flag. It's a white with a dark red. That's their. That's not the British flag.
Just England by itself without.
Oh, England has its own flag.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's such a. It is so obviously Christian. I don't know. Doesn't seem that great. Okay. I didn't know England had its own flag. Okay, that's interesting. Okay. Okay, so the where we left off was the Sarei Yehuda Binyamin, the adversaries of Yehuda and Binyamin, which we identified as the Kusim, the Samaritans, wanted to join in the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. Zerubbabel and Yeshua, the Kohen Gadol, refused, and as a result, they meaning the Sarei Yehuda Binyamin, the Samaritans, compiled a sitna, a list of accusations against the Jewish people, saying that they are rebellious, that they are rebuilding the temple to create a fortress from which they will throw off the rule of the king, and they will not pay taxes, a tax revolt, right, like the American Revolution, taxation without representation, whatever it would be. And as a result, Koresh issued an edict that the construction of the Beis Hamikdash has to stop, and indeed it stopped for 18 years. So now again, I just want to give you a little chronology here because 18 years becomes important both at the beginning and at the end. There were 18 years from the conquest of Eretz Yisrael by Babylonia until the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Right, 18 years between the Babylonian conquest and the Churban. And therefore, Koresh's proclamation was 52 years after the Churban, but it was 70 years from the Babylonian conquest. So we have two different measurements of the 70 years and two different consequences at the end of the 70 years. There 70 years from the Babylonian conquest, which is not the exile yet. People were not exiled. But 70 years from the Babylonian conquest, Koresh gave us permission to return. 70 years from the Churban Beis Hamikdash, we actually did build the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so the way Chazal describe it, they say that 70 years from the conquest, we got what is called a Pekida. Pekida means God remembered us by giving us the opportunity to come back, but the Geula did not take place until sometime later. The reason why that's important is that some describe the Messianic process of today as being similar, in which the return of the Jews to Eretz Yisrael is the first stage, just like Koresh, and it will culminate in the second stage of Binyan Beis Hamikdash. We hope B'meira v'yameinu, but the return to Eretz Yisrael is also part of the redemption, just as the return under Koresh was the first stage of that redemption. Of course, the difference is that most of the Jews did in fact not return then. Oh, that's fine, but at least that Pekida could have resulted in a Messianic Geula. Remember, I think I've mentioned a number of times that the second Beis Hamikdash itself could have been Messianic, and there could have been Bias Mashiach. And Zerubbabel is described by Chagai, in particular, as being Mashiach. But because most of the Jews did not return to Eretz Yisrael, we were not Zocha. We were Zocha to a Beis Hamikdash eventually, but it was not a Messianic Beis Hamikdash. It was a Beis Hamikdash that eventually would be destroyed. In fact, in the book of Yecheskel, now Yecheskel was a Navi who lived like Yirmiyahu. He's a contemporary of Yirmiyahu. He lived at the time of the Churban. And the last prakim of Sefer Yecheskel actually give you a detailed architectural plan for the final Beis Hamikdash. The Bayis Shalishi will follow Yecheskel. Now we know that the Bayis Sheni, whose dimensions are described in a whole tractate of Mishnah, Maseches Midas, was not the right. We have two different architectural plans in the Torah, not counting Mishkan, which is in the Torah, but in Tanakh we have two architectural plans for the temple. We have the architectural blueprint of Shlomo HaMelech's bias, which is the bias Rishain. That is in Sefer Malachim. And then we have an architectural plan for the future Beis HaMikdash, which is in the book of Yecheskel. And the book of Yecheskel is a very, very different looking Beis HaMikdash than the book of Malachim, for whatever the reason. Now, the problem is when we look at the Bayis Sheni, the second Beis HaMikdash, which they began constructing here, which got greatly, greatly beautified in Herod's time, and there's a whole Maseches of Mishnayos that describe the layout of the Bayis Sheni, Maseches Midas. We find that the Bayis Sheni does not correspond to the binyan of Shlomo, nor does it correspond to the binyan of Yecheskel. So what exactly was the principle that guided the Jews who built the Bayis Sheni? So the Rambam says the following idea. When they built the Bayis Sheni, by the time they built the Bayis Sheni, they realized it was not going to be the Messianic temple. See, people often make a mistake. They often look at the end of Yecheskel and they say, this is describing the third Beis HaMikdash. Well, not really. Yecheskel lived during the Chorban Bayis Rishon, and Yecheskel is giving us a nevuah regarding the building of the temple, which will be eternal and redemptive. From Yecheskel's perspective, that could have been the Bayis Sheni after 70 years. Meaning, had we been Zeicha, we would have had Mashiach, and that would have been the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash of Yecheskel would have been not the third Beis HaMikdash, the second one would have been Mashiach. Elamai, we were not Zeicha because too few Jews were willing to come to Eretz Yisrael. At least that's one of the reasons. So therefore, the Chachamim understood that the second temple is not the final temple. They understood that the second temple is not messianic. They understood, therefore, that the second temple is going to be destroyed. And therefore, they did not build it in accordance with the instructions of Yecheskel, because the instructions of Yecheskel are for the eternal Beis HaMikdash that will never be destroyed, and that could have been the second one. But by the time they got around to building the second one, they understood that was no longer the case. So what the Rambam says is, the second Beis HaMikdash is modeled on the first with certain features taken from Yecheskel to kind of remind us that there will be a third temple that will be forever, but it does not correspond entirely to the third Mikdash, because the third Mikdash will never be destroyed, and this temple was known to be destroyed, that it will be destroyed. Ad Kedei Kach, that the Rambam actually writes in the Perish HaMishnayos to Maseches Rosh Hashanah, that during the entire 420 years of the second Beis HaMikdash, until it was destroyed by the Romans, the Jewish people observed the fast of the 9th of Av. They fasted on the 9th of Av when they had a Beis HaMikdash. Now you may wonder, why would they? Tisha B'Av is a fast day in which we mourn the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Why would you fast when you have a Beis HaMikdash? So there are two possible reasons. Answer number one is, just as the people were crying when they built the second Mikdash, when they began the foundation of the second Mikdash, because they saw how lower it was in terms of Kedusha. So even during the Bayis Sheni, they're mourning the Bayis Rishon, Nevuah, Aron HaKodesh, all those things. But the other reason is that they knew, they didn't know when, but they knew that this second temple is going to be destroyed, because once it's not the Messianic temple, it's going to be destroyed. So every Tisha B'Av, they mourned because they were waiting, as the expression goes, for the other shoe to fall. Like Rav Soloveitchik suggests, that perhaps it wasn't so much mourning as it was praying, meaning when we lost the Beis HaMikdash, we mourn over our loss. There, we had a Beis HaMikdash, but we know we're going to lose it. So Tisha B'Av is not so much about mourning as it is about praying that Hashem should have mercy. See, this may explain an interesting issue that Rav Sadia Gaon brings up. On Tisha B'Av, we recite a genre of prayer that we call Kehillas. Kehillas means lamentations, which is the English name for Eicha, but indeed, Chazal call the book of Eicha Sefer Kehillas. They actually call it Kehillas. But Kehillas are all of these poems about the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Rav Sadia Gaon says that there was a minhag still in his time, which talking about the 900s, in which they would say Salichos on Tisha B'Av. Now we're familiar with Salichos from the month of Elul and during other fast days. Now, what is the difference between Salichos and Kehillas? They do have a different format. Salichos, you recite piyutim, you recite the poems, but then you say the 13 midos of Rachamim. Kehillas, you don't say the Yud Gimel midos of Rachamim. So Rav Sadia Gaon says, either instead of Kehillas or in addition to Kehillas, they used to say Salichos on Tisha B'Av, although that's not our minhag today. What's the idea? Kehillas are poems of mourning, lamentation, sadness. Salichos are prayers that God should forgive us and bring the redemption. So here's the idea. If during the Second Temple period, they did have a fast, but it wasn't so much a fast of mourning, because they have a Beis HaMikdash. It was a fast praying to Hashem that he shouldn't destroy this temple, although they know that it's coming at some point. Praying for another year, a little more time. Then one can understand why that might have emphasized Slichos more than Kehillas. And the minhag of Slichos, even after the Churban Bayis Sheni, may have been a continuation of the way they kept Tisha B'Av. I don't mean they had the actual Slichos. They didn't have those particular poems. But the Slichos motif actually fits the nature of the fasting during the Bayis Sheni.
Since a negative prophecy can be reversed, is there any hope of that in this?
Yes, that may have been the possibility, that even something that would no longer, that was not messianic, might be converted by tshuva and the like. So that could be why they fasted. So again, the point was not mourning, the point would be praying through tshuva to get divine forgiveness. Okay? But that's what the Rambam writes, that the reason why the Second Temple did not have all the features of Yechezkel's temple is because they felt it was not messianic, it was going to be destroyed. So they modeled it on Shlomo HaMelech's Beis HaMikdash, but they incorporated some of the architectural features of the Mikdash Shlishi. Now, anyway, be it as it may, we now have this 18-year period in which nothing's happening in building the Beis HaMikdash. Now, interestingly enough, just to give you a sense of history, after Koresh comes the reign of Achashverosh of Purim, and after Achashverosh comes the reign of Achashverosh's son from Esther, Daryavesh II. And it is in the second year of Daryavesh that he authorizes the reconstruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. And he lifts the edict of Koresh. So from Koresh's interdiction till the second year of Darius is 18 years. And in the middle of that time was the reign of Achashverosh. And in the middle of that time is the whole story of Purim. It's pretty amazing. You know, Purim is a big deal. I mean, the Jewish people were slated for total destruction. And a great miracle happened. And this happened during this period of time, the 18 years. And yet there's absolutely no mention in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. They mention Achashverosh. They mention this king Achashverosh. Achashverosh is mentioned. But there's absolutely no discussion at all of this gezerah against the Jews and the miraculous salvation of the Jews. It's a little strange why it's omitted. Omissions are difficult to justify. I mean, I had mentioned, for example, another omission when it discusses when they came back, they began bringing korbanos on Rosh Hashanah and they celebrated Sukkot. So I think I mentioned, why is there no mention of Yom Kippur? Why is Yom Kippur omitted? It's a good question. Well, here I would also say, Why is there no reference to the story of Purim? The story of Purim happened during these 18 years. And in this connection, I want to share with you a chazal that actually say that in spite of the fact that the Tzorei Yehuda or Binyamin that wrote the sitna, wrote the accusation, seemed to be the Samaritans from Kus, the Kusim. Chazal say that the primary instigators were not them. The primary instigators were the 10 sons of Haman who were living in Persia, and they convinced Koresh to issue this interdiction. And the reason they were hung, Haman was killed, we know that, but why were the 10 children of Haman killed? Because they tried to stop the building of the Beis Medrash. And there's a remiss to this too, in other ways. Remember when Achashverosh does not, going back to Megillah Esther, when Achashverosh does not know who Esther is, he doesn't know that Esther's Jewish. And Esther makes a party, and Esther invites Achashverosh and Haman. And Achashverosh says, "What can I do for you? Ad chatzi amalchus v'seyos. I will give you up to half of my kingdom if you want it." So Chazal have an interesting drasha. Up to half of my kingdom, but not half of my kingdom, meaning I will give you up to half, but not the thing that's right in the middle. And that refers to the Beis HaMikdash, which in a spiritual sense is in the middle of the world. Yerushalayim is the middle of the world. So Achashverosh doesn't know. He's hedging his bets. Maybe he says, maybe Esther is Jewish, which of course she is, but he doesn't know. And maybe what she'll ask me to do is for me to give permission to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So he has to say, I'll give you everything but that. Ad chatzi amalchus v'seyos. But indeed, it's an irony that, according to Chazal, Darius II, Daryavesh Hasheni, who is the son of Achashverosh, is also the son of Esther, meaning to say, Esther had a son from Achashverosh, who became king. Now, halachically, that actually means he was Jewish, because his mother was Jewish. Did Daryavesh Hasheni regard himself as Jewish? How did he self-identify? Was he from? Did we have a Persian king who would put on tefillin, in the back room every morning? Exactly how did that work? We don't know a lot. In many, many ways, this is a tragic aspect of Esther's life. Now, I remember when I was in kindergarten, we used to do Purim things. So the way they market the story of Purim, even in Orthodox schools, for little kids, is it was a beauty contest, and Queen Esther was paraded around, and she was the most beautiful one, and she was chosen, like she won, Miss Universe contest or something. You have to understand that this was the tragedy of Esther's life. A righteous woman, a tzadekes, a saintly woman, a woman who was married to one of the great Gedolei Hador, Mordechai, is forcibly taken against her will to the palace. And indeed, Chazal even discuss why didn't she allow herself to be killed, Gilead Rise, and there are different answers to that. But this was not some happy thing that Esther became queen. For whatever the reason, it was part of the divine providence that she had to be in that place at that time to be able to orchestrate a salvation for the Jewish people. But it was a tragedy. And she had repeated intercourse with Achashverosh. That was a tragedy. And she had a child from Achashverosh. On that level, there's a tragedy there. And as I say, was the child raised Jewish? We really have no idea. But one of the interesting ironies is that the Persian king who finally allowed the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash after 18 years of interdiction happened to be a Jew. Daryavesh Hasheni was Jewish. So just as they say, there are different popes who might be Jewish, they go over this. So the king of Persia who allowed the building of the Beis HaMikdash was a Jew. Maybe it was only a Jew who would have allowed it. The other, a non-Jewish Persian king would have just kept the prohibition in place. Yeah.
Does that mean Darius II could have been a mamzer?
Well, halachically he would not be, simply because we actually paskin that a child that a Jewish woman has from a non-Jewish man is not a mamzer, even if she's married, even if she's a married woman. So if, God forbid, a woman is raped or a woman has an affair with a non-Jew, the child is not a mamzer. So Darius II would not be a mamzer. He would be a Jew with a non-Jewish father, but halachically he's Jewish. In fact, I'll tell you a little. It's a total digression, but I'll tell you an interesting story that involves somebody who used to learn it many, many years ago. It was potentially a very, very serious shaila, and it taught me a lesson in terms of being sure to get all your facts. The person came to me and said that his mother told him that the man he thought was his father is not his father, that in fact she had an affair. She was mazaneh with somebody, and he is the child of that somebody. Now, potentially, this is a very, very, very serious problem, because if in fact a woman has an affair, a woman who's married to a Jew has an affair with somebody and has a kid, the kid is Jewish, but the kid is a mamzer. He can't marry regular Jews, etc. He can only marry a mamzeres, or he could marry a gioris, etc. So he wanted to know, is he chas v'sholem a mamzer? Now, no, if you're not from, you don't care about this, you don't ask. But if you become religious, you become a Baal Tshuva, the issue of mamzer is a very, very heavy issue. So one of the things that we look at today, the first thing we look at today is, well, wait a second here. You are only a mamzer if your mother is halachically married. If your mother is not halachically married, you're not a mamzer. So what makes a halachic marriage? So it's not the rabbi. Theoretically, even a Reform rabbi could make a valid marriage. What makes a marriage halachic are the witnesses. There have to be two kosher witnesses who witness the giving of the ring. By kosher, I mean, number one, they have to be men, they have to be Jewish, they have to be bar mitzvah, they cannot be related to each other or related to the chassan or the kallah, and most importantly, they have to be halachically observant. Any marriage that does not have halachic witnesses is not a marriage. You don't need a get. If it's not a marriage, then a woman that has an affair is not committing adultery. It's simply out of wedlock. A kid born out of wedlock is not a mamzer. So the very first thing we want you to investigate is, if this kid says that his mother said she had an affair, well, let's see if your mother's marriage to your father, or to the person you thought was your father, is valid. So this was very, very tricky, because they were married in a shul by a rabbi who was conservative, and that would normally be enough to invalidate the marriage. But the problem was, the rabbi had originally been Orthodox and the shul had been Orthodox, and there was a transition exactly around the time that the mother got married to the father. Meaning, we're not really sure. Was this done under conservative auspices? Was it done under Orthodox auspices? Even if it was under Orthodox auspices, maybe the rabbi had already become conservative in his theology. I wasn't sure. So at this point, I thought it was a little, so I sent out an email. I'm a member of the Rabbinical Council of America, and you send out emails, and I said, hey, so-and-so rabbi in 1958, kosher wedding, not kosher wedding, what was it? What type of weddings did he do? Again, I want to emphasize, to correct, just be clear. I don't mean that the rabbi made it. I meant that if the rabbi was conservative, his witnesses would not be kosher.
Right,
The
makes sense.
the issue is not the rabbi, the issue is the witnesses, but the identity of the rabbi will normally be very relevant in this. So I sent out an email to the Rabbinical Council of America saying, hey, anyone knows about this rabbi, 1958, etc. So a guy sent back, which he thought he was giving me good news, because he thought I was looking to validate the wedding. He says, yeah, I have a video of a wedding that this rabbi conducted that very year, and it was 100% halachic wedding. It was wonderful. He was makbid on Shomer Shabbos witnesses. Yeah, thanks a lot. Which means now we're in big trouble, because if the rabbi was Orthodox and the wedding was kosher, then the woman's married. Woman's married. You have a problem with mamzer. So at this point, I said, maybe this is above my pay grade. Let's go to Gedolei HaPoskim. So here's what the guy said to me. The guy said to me, listen to this. That's just my luck. Not only am I a mom, not only is my father a goy, but I'm even a mamzer. I said, what? Yeah, he said, my mother had an affair with a goy, so I don't even have that. I said, again, why didn't I ask that question? It was stupid of me. I said, this is it. You're not a mamzer. The Gemara says in Yevamos Beferish that a non-Jew that has relations with a Jewish woman, the kid is not a mamzer, even if the woman is married. This is the Gezeres HaKasan. So this is an amazing thing. The very thing that you think is like the worst thing in your life turns out to be the best thing in your life. There's no mamzer problem. Baruch Hashem. So this is a long-winded answer to your question. Therefore, Darius II would not be a mamzer under any definition. Now, I do want to point out on the Etzem Shaila, the truth of the matter is, mom is not believed anyway. I mean, that's the short answer, meaning you need halachic witnesses. In other words, if a person's mother tells him, I fathered you, I gave birth to you from another man, halachically, she's not believed. So there's not enough evidence here. And therefore, halachically, there wouldn't be a mamzer even had she been with the Jewish guy if there's no Adam. In fact, this is another story, very, very interesting story with Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein was once Mesader Kedushin for a young couple, and the chassan had lost his mother many, many years before. And his mother had given him a locket that he should wear around his neck that on the day of his wedding, he should open up. This is such a bizarre story. So he thought it'll be a message. I'm with you. I love you. I'm thinking about you in Shemayim, some very beautiful thing. He opens it up, and there's a little note there. He's under the chuppah with Rav Moshe Feinstein. He opens it, and the note says, your father is not your father. You were born from an affair that I had, and you're a mamzer. Now, if she wants to, this is such a bizarre story. I mean, if she wants to tell him that, says, open this under the chuppah, like okay, the story makes no sense to me. But anyway, he opens it. He thinks he's going to get this message from his mom about how much she loves him. He says, you're a mamzer, I had an affair. So he turns white. He starts shaking. He's really, really shaking. And Rav Moshe sees how upset he is. He says, what's the matter? What's the matter? And the person hands Rav Moshe the note. Under the chuppah, there's a wedding. Rav Moshe looks at the note. He rips it up, puts it in his pocket, and says, let's continue with the chuppah. Because the basic idea is, mom doesn't have ne'emanos. Again, I hope this is not taken as a negative against mothers, but a mother is not ne'eman to say her son is a mamzer. This is not within the scope of what she is permitted to say. So as a result, even if mom left a note that says you are a mamzer because you come from adultery, Rav Moshe said, let's go on and finish the marriage. Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense, though, Rabbi. If she admits that she had an affair and it's with a non-Jew.
Well, with a Jew, yeah, in this case, yep.
That still happened, though.
Well, again, halacha has its rules of evidence. Halacha has what is admissible, what is not admissible. So what happened may have happened, but halachically it has to be proven. And halachically, this is not valid proof. And if halacha says it's not valid proof, you are allowed to proceed as if it didn't happen, because it's not the actual affair, it's the ability to prove it in a halachically valid way. So these rules of evidence are extremely important. And this is very nogea l'maisa, because sometimes parents do tell their children, for a good reason, whatever, even for halachic reasons, that you have this problem and that problem and that problem, but it's not always a davar pashut that particularly the mother would be believed. So there are two ways out of the mamzer issue, so to speak. One is if the adulterer was a non-Jew, there is no mamzer. And two is if you only know it from the admission of the mother, that would not create mamzerus either. Now there is a big machlokas achronim. Can DNA establish mamzerus? That's a very interesting issue. I mean, let's assume that a child is genetically tested, either an old-fashioned blood test or the more modern DNA testing, and it's established conclusively under DNA test that this kid is not the child of this woman's husband. Can a DNA test be used to establish mamzerus? So first of all, many poskim say, if all the DNA test is doing is excluding the father, but it doesn't establish who is the father, because we don't have then we can assume that the father is a guy. In other words, there's no reason, even if this kid is not the son of this man, that doesn't make him a mamzer if it's from a guy. So that's one thing. But many poskim say even if the DNA establishes that it's from a Jewish man, so it would be adultery. Rabbi Yashiv took the position that, it's a little difficult scientifically, that DNA is not halachically reliable evidence. It is not sufficient, and therefore mamzeris cannot be established by a DNA test. That's a machlokas. Other poskim say yes, but as I say, the machlokas is only if it establishes that a Jew is the father. If it doesn't establish who is the father, then for sure it would not create mamzeris, because we would just assume that the father is a non-Jew. Yeah.
I think it's kind of a little different. Isn't there an opinion that Esther created like a demon clone of herself?
Yes. So in Kabbalah, right. So that's very, very true. That's not in the Gemara at all. The Gemara assumes always that Daryavish Hasheni is the natural biological son of Esther Hamalka, but there is in Kabbalah various references that Daryavish Hasheni kind of came from a demon model of Esther, and it was not really Esther. Again, it was a way of not wanting to connect Esther to something so unsavory. Huh? And then he wouldn't be Jewish. That would take away that point. But then the question becomes, why would he have the impetus to allow the building of the Beis Medrash if he comes from demonic origins? Maybe because he knew it was going to be destroyed, so he figures let them have it for a few hundred years. Yeah.
Does the reliance on that it's probably a non-Jewish father change if you're in, let's say, Israel, where the majority of the people are Jewish?
That's a very good question. That is a very good question. The assumption that we make in Chutz La'aretz, that since most people, the overwhelming majority, are non-Jews, therefore we assume non-Jewish parentage, may not work in Israel, where we still have, Baruch Hashem, we still have a majority of Jews, although not as big a majority as you might assume. Nevertheless, some say, if we don't know where the woman might have conceived, you can look at all of the countries together in that. So the point basically is, I just want to mention that if God forbid someone is confronted with a mamzer problem, a very common instance would be that you're born from a second marriage and mom didn't get a get from marriage number one, etc., that one should not despair. One should obviously talk to a Rav about it, because there are usually ways in which the stigma of mamzer can be avoided. Okay, but be it as it may, I did want to bring in that the Aseres B'nai Haman were actually involved in the beetle of the Beis Hamikdash for those 18 years. One second here. So basically what happens is that the 18 years are skipped. There's nothing recorded, even though the story of Purim happened in the 18 years. That's another book. But the book of Ezra just fast forwards 18 years. So we're now past the reign of Koresh, past the reign of Achashverosh, and we are in the reign of Daryavish Hasheni, the son of Esther. And Parakeh describes the very interesting way in which Daryavish Hasheni authorized the continuation of the building of the Beis Hamikdash, and the initiation didn't come from him. We bring here, and this is a comparatively rare reference. Normally, biblical books do not cross-reference each other, right? So in the book of Yeshayahu, you're not going to read about Yechezkel or whatever it is. But here we have a few cross-references. In the book of Ezra, there is a cross-reference to two Nevi'im, Haggai and Zechariah. Now remember, Haggai and Zechariah have their own books. These are two of the 12 Trei Asar, the so-called, they call them minor prophets. That's an awful name. They're not minor prophets, but their books are smaller. Haggai and Zechariah. Remember that at the beginning of the Second Temple period, these are the last prophets, and the last three prophets are Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Malachi is not cross-referenced here, but Haggai and Zechariah are. And Chagai and Zechariah give Musar to the Jewish people, telling them, why are you delaying the building of the Beis HaMikdash? It's time to ask for permission. So, the idea was the Jewish people had gotten into a bad habit already. 18 years. We weren't allowed to build a Beis HaMikdash. The rest of Koresh's reign. The rest of Achashverosh's reign. Now Darius Hasheni. So they just got out of the habit. They weren't even seeking to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. They figured it was just a done deal that until Moshiach comes, that's it. So Chagai and Zechariah tell them, start doing it. They start doing it in violation of the law. The Tzareh Yehuda ben Yamin reported to Darius II, and he permits it. So this is a very interesting sequence. It's not that he permitted it and then they continued. Rather, they deliberately broke the edict, which sparked an accusation again, and Darius II dismissed it, which means this is what we would call, in modern vocabulary, civil disobedience. They broke the law in the expectation that the law would be changed. But they didn't do that until they were given permission by the prophets, Chagai and Zechariah, who presumably were given a nevuah from Hashem, that this would be legitimate. Meaning, you could ask the question, if all they had to do was break the law and then it would be annulled, why didn't they do that for 18 years? And why didn't Chagai and Zechariah give them Musar earlier than that? The answer is, at that point, it wouldn't have availed. So this is an interesting idea that sometimes, in order to get God's brachos, you have to take the initiative. You can't just wait around and say, I'm going to wait around until the king gives us permission. That's not what happened. What you got to do is you take the initiative, and then the king will give you the permission based on the decision that you made. See, just like by Kriyas Yamsuf. The waters of the Yamsuf did not split until Nachshon ben Aminadav jumped into the water up to his neck, up to his mouth, up to his nose. And when he demonstrated he had complete faith in Hashem, then the water split. Had he not made that first jump, the water would not have split. You see? Same thing here. Darius II gives permission, but only because we took the initiative to rebuild, to start rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash in violation of that law. Okay, so that's an interesting point to consider when people say, for example, again, I'm just drawing analogies, I'm not saying these are proofs, that you're not allowed to have a Jewish state until Mashiach comes. You're not allowed to come to Israel until Mashiach comes. All the different versions, maybe we'll talk more about that. But the short answer to that is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu waits for us to take a first step, and then he will bless our efforts. If we simply wait for Hashem to do something, Hashem says, you're not interested enough, so why am I going to do it for you? And that's exactly how this worked with the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. Okay, be careful.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.